Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jaya Ravindran, one of the co-directors of Milli Archives Foundation. Me, along with my colleagues Maya Dodd and Venkat Srinivasan, we are here to make this presentation online. Thank you for having us online. And our topic for the day is how do you solve a problem like an archive? But before that, let me just introduce you to Milli. What is Milli? Maya? Milli Archives Foundation is a collective of individuals and communities passionate about nurturing archives. It's based in India. We started somewhere around 2019 as an informal group. COVID pandemic gave us an opportunity to connect with many more other individuals and institutions across the globe. And slowly we started feeling that we should formalize ourselves to play a more proactive role. And that's when we decided to set up this as a non-profit company. Last year in April 2023, we were incorporated as Section 8 non-profit company by Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Government of India. Within a year, we have got tax exemptions too, which is definitely encouraging for us. And of course, it is a very unique space in India. But why the need to set up Milli? Archives, as we know, all over the world, it touches upon everyone and everything. Nothing is complete without an archive, whether it be government policies, stories, literary work, reports, ecology, almost everything is based on some archive. I mean, archives is everywhere. But unfortunately in India, archives doesn't get the, its due position, its due recognition or care, even the archives professionals for that matter. There's no existing platform for archival discovery or for archival standards, for archival conservation, even pedagogy. Archives do not, as I already mentioned, it does not get its due. There is no existing nonprofit to set standards or to raise the bar, get the public to visit archives, to encourage them to, discover the unknown or unheard of stories that are lying there. No such organization is there. There's no digital archival platform for India to enable discovery and facilitate knowledge sharing. And Milli aspires to be that space. We want to fill that gap. And of course, our journey so far has been very encouraging. Apart from scores of individuals, now we also have some institutions as a partner in institutions. They have taken our memberships also. From the list, which is already on screen, you can see that they have different, very, very different profiles. Some of them are related to architecture, science, contemporary history, ecology, community, queer history. I'm sure that over a time period, the number of partners will also go up. But what is also encouraging is that at least 50% of these institutions are public institutions, and hopefully many more will join us. Over to Maya.
Thank you so much, Jaya. So as you can see, Milli is trying to ignite a public conversation about the relevance of archives beyond only archival institutions. And so we have proceeded along 4 verticals. As you know, we sort of increased our engagement during the pandemic. And since then, we've been able to make dents across these different energies. Of course, collecting is at the heart of every archive. And we'll talk further about a benchmarking tool that we are in the process of devising towards instrumentalizing this better. In terms of engagement, we have over 4 years of online programming, and this is almost 30 to 40 hours of streaming, spotlights on archives, conversations with archivists, questions about pedagogy. It's all up on our YouTube channel and is there to watch again for anybody who would so like to. It was made with volunteer energy, and it was really a combination of a very diverse set of stakeholders, from government to private to individual to community archives. So I think the showcasing of these efforts really underline the fact that this is a very large community with very different engagements, and the need to bring them together was at the heart of what Milli sought to do. In terms of research, with the help of the International Council on Archives, we were able to put out a guidebook on archives and ethics. And of course, in terms of education, we continue to try. So if you look at sort of the range of archives featured on our YouTube channel, I think it brings some beginning of a sense of how this emerging field is only ever growing. This year, there was actually some attempts at making directories of archives in India. And the number is sort of estimated at 600 or so in terms of the directories that were created. But I think we have a long ways to go. And this has just been the beginning. Of course, the programming was online since 2020. And after, we've also had in-person events. So we had a workshop on conservation last year in Bangalore. And we continue to try to sort of convene common interest across all of us. The guidebook, as I mentioned, is something that continues to evolve. And it's been considered very, very useful, mentioned by many as a sort of cheat sheet on how sort of some basic questions around legal questions, particularly around archiving in India, can be dealt with. We are now looking to update this in terms of digital privacy and new legislation that's awaited in India. So in that sense, we hope to kind of get that conversation, continued. And finally, there's been a real appetite for capacity building. So in terms of training workshops, in terms of curricular additions, it's really fascinating that across the higher education ecosystem, there is this demand to include archiving as a course. This is especially happening in literature and history departments, because I think it's also seen as the professional face of what these fields can do. And there's a lot of talk about what will the future of jobs look like, etc. So in that sense, this training really, I think, can be critical toward building, new capacities. So in that sense, we'll now proceed with this one tool that we've been developing. And Venkat, I'll leave this to you.
Thanks, Maya. Thanks, and thanks everyone for letting us do this. So sorry that we're not there in person. So collecting is, of course, at the heart. And our question is really, we get quite a lot of questions around how do you build an archive, or, what does it take to build an archive? And we've situated ourselves slightly differently. And I just wanted to sort of highlight this idea of the third space, which has been around since the 80s. Of course, Oldenburg's work has looked at this increasing need for places that are informal public gathering spaces that don't need membership. They're distinct from home and work. They offer a sense of comfort and support, and really a space where you can see, hear, and know each other. And for us, it's a need for a space to reflect the diversity of society. This image that you see is from a poster from an artist who developed this idea of the library as being part of this third space in society. This is at least where we would like to be. Maya, next slide. But the reality in India is unfortunately very, very different. Not only is the archive not seen as a third space, it is, it's largely seen, it's not even seen as a space at all. This image is just a sort of a small metaphor to say that there is a large body of people who are constantly gravitating to other things, while the archive itself is firewalled. It has a bunch of gatekeepers, has a few historians who might know how to navigate that space. With a set of people who are overeager to ensure that you do not have access to the diverse material in the archive. So this is sort of the context in which we sort of went ahead and decided to develop what is it going to take to develop a benchmarking and an assessment tool for archives to develop in this country. And so what we are trying to do here is to really center the idea of diversity across the agents of the archival object. So what you see in the center square, I hope you can see it, is that there's a certain journey that the archival object takes from being restricted to being a public document over the course of sometimes many, many generations. And so throughout this process, you have various individuals, creator, donors, community, archivists, funders, archives, users, and of course, finally, the audience. And so we thought, why don't we look at all these agents and systematically think about how do we invert the case and just constantly say, how can we do better within that scope? How can we think a little more carefully about who and what is being archived? Who gets to do the archiving in the first place? How is it archived? Who gets to fund it? Who uses it? Who sees it? And of course, what's the consequence of seeing? What's the afterlife of access, as it were? And so we're developing a benchmarking and an assessment tool that tries to take this systematically across the board from the point of initiating an archive to the end. Next slide. Jai?
Yeah. This is, in fact, a very interesting project for us. This will be our first project as Milli Archives Foundation. And as Venkat has already said, the idea is to assess and also come up with a benchmarking tool for assessing the quality of an archive. It's definitely to be done in two modes, qualitative and graded scale. And almost all the 12 criteria that relates to an archive, right from its establishment to the final, say, use of an archive, or what happens to a material once it is used. Almost all these parameters, all these criteria, 12 criteria that we have identified, Venkat will be explaining more about it. We'll be coming up with questionnaires that will be shared with all the agents that we mentioned in the last slide. All of them will have their own responses to the questionnaires. And of course, the questionnaires will be very simple. It will be more or less in yes or no format. The idea is to encourage people to answer. If we ask them to write something, they may not. And also, it is like among the agents, you must have noticed that it's not just the user, it's the archive itself which is there. Even they would be encouraged to fill up this form, this questionnaire, and each of them may have their own perspective on answering that. The idea is also not to be judgmental about any archive, judge their performance or anything. The idea is to bring out the diversity. Maybe, if they see this questionnaire, that may encourage, these archives to at least identify one or two criteria or whatever they want to identify as of interest to them. Maybe that will encourage them to improve themselves or come up to a certain standard. And that is what we are trying to do. The idea is ultimately not to be judged, not to identify an archive just on the basis of its size, collections, the age of an archive. Quite possible that a very small archive or a new archive, they may be having better way of, showcasing their collections. Venkat?
Thanks, Jaya. So our 12 criteria sort of just jog us along the path of the archival object. And so at every step, we are just asking, can we do better? Can we think slightly more in a slightly more diverse way? So at the level of the scope and the objective, once an archive has decided that it's an archive for queer histories, the question is, well, whose stories are actually entering the archive? Or even if it's an institutional archive, which members who are associated with an institution, whose stories get to enter? So that's a starting framework that you start with a basic answer, but you push yourself by trying to think of how you can do better along each of these axes. Acquisition methods, are you looking at physical material, or can you also consider oral histories? Can you consider artifacts and reimagine this question of the archive as being a space that captures process? So where is the process in the artifact? The archivist is a serious question in India in particular, especially given so many different limitations for people to become archivists in the first place. So the question of how do you diversify the demographic of the keeper of the material is essential to asking the first question of, whose stories are entering the archive. Funding has been largely state funding for most public institutions in this country, but how do you really get to fund and build the archive in a way that you diversify the pots of money that you're sourcing from? Finding some combination of public, for-profit revenue models, philanthropic models, and closely thinking about the user-creator economics, about what does it mean to have someone being able to use the material that someone else has created. Description is something that we're actually super excited about. How do we diversify the description of the archival object? And these are digital tools that we're also trying to develop to allow diverse ways of interpreting the same object from various communities. But of course, to do that in a way that balances with archival standards. Even something like preservation, which might seem slightly odd in this mix, is to say, how do we really diversify our physical or digital security and storage? So how do we build redundancy in the storage conditions? And this question is also closely tied to ownership. The archive, of course, owns the material, most of the time. But how do you diversify this in such a way that you allow for copies of material to coexist with the physical material that an archive has? Or how do you allow the metadata to be decoupled from the archival material, just so that you allow for various ways of thinking about preservation in the first place? Access is, of course, I think in that art that we've shown, access to archives in India, for anyone who's tried to do that, especially at state institutions, is quite the challenge. And there's a question of how does one get to actually see the object? What kind of entry forms do you need to access the archive? Can you do better as an archive in the way you simplify, in the way you make your material visible to the world? Most importantly, who gets to see it? And societal hierarchies come into play here again. And coupled to this is the question of access modes. Most archives in India are, of course, websites, their websites are in English, but the vast majority of the country speaks many other thousands of other languages. So how do you diversify the catalog? And how do you use tools that help enable that? Of course, the Atom tool is an example of something that looks at developing finding aids across various languages. As we do this, the other question is, how do you think about the future user? The Indian Copyright Act, for instance, has various kinds of exemptions, which are actually quite unique based on issues relating to disability, to the non-commercial access. But most archives are largely unaware. So how do you really diversify your future user base by implementing existing laws that are available to you so that you can actually open and make your archive more aware to a broader cross-section of people? Outreach is something that doesn't happen often enough in schools and colleges in India. So there's again a question of who is the audience, but more importantly, who could be your audience? How do you get the average 12th standard student to just be very familiar with the idea of the archive? And you could do small things like, of course, running education programs, but even silly ideas like running public darbars may go a long way in the way you think about outreach of the archive. Privacy is really this question of the afterlife of the material. What happens after it goes public? How do you, of course, you may have takedown policies. You may have some way of thinking about data protection. India doesn't have a really reasonable, it doesn't have an implemented Data Protection Act yet. So, but how do you really broaden this ethical access, and how do you think about harm reduction? And how do you diversify the way in which you think about it? So, for instance, can the archive actually start to work back with the creators community to rethink privacy? And finally, the last question here is, in the long run, there are all these agents that we had mentioned, from creator to funder to the user to the audience. How really can you think they can better speak to each other in a way that helps us understand how these stories are actually intertwined? And hopefully that process will get us to a point, as we're going to try and show you in the next slide, to a point where you really start to think of the archive as the third space, as the space that is both in between stories and also in between various members of the community. In Steedman's article, something she called a fever sheet, of course, famously had said that archives hold everything in medias res. The account caught halfway through, most of it missing with no end ever in sight. But the archive has to be, at least for us in India, for it to really be a challenging idea, it has to be seen as this in-between space, both across stories and across various members of the community. So with that, we'll just try and wrap up to say that we're a small team of people who are corely involved. I mean, the core team is small, but we have a large set of people who have been volunteers and various participating institutions. And we're just getting started. And we want to sort of also give a shout out to Alolika, who's a researcher who's been steering this project, this benchmarking and assessment tool in the last few weeks. I think that's about it. And I think we're on time. Okay. So yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for letting us do this.